The streets outside were quiet, wrapped in a heavy blanket of snow. Inside, the fireplace crackled, filling the house with a warmth that felt ironic given the chill in my thoughts. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, adorned with lights and ornaments we'd collected over 35 years of marriage. Linda, my wife, had been acting strangely for weeks. She claimed it was the holiday stress, last-minute shopping, organizing dinners, keeping up appearances. But I knew better. I've built my life on observing people, reading between the lines. What I saw in Linda was something I hadn't seen before, a distance, a detachment. Tonight, her behavior confirmed my worst fears. She came down the stairs in a crimson dress that clung to her like a promise. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled to perfection. She looked radiant, but it wasn't for me. "Where are you off to?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Dinner with some friends," she said, barely glancing in my direction as she adjusted her diamond necklace, the one I gave her on our 25th anniversary. "It's nothing formal." I didn't react immediately. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, studying her as she avoided my gaze. "All right," I said finally, nodding toward the door. "Don't let them keep you out too late." She smiled, polite, distant, and left without another word. As soon as I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I moved quickly. Linda always left her planner on the hall table, and tonight was no exception. I flipped it open to today's date. 8 p.m. Penthouse Suite 1503. VH. Victor Harper. The name was like a slap in the face. A millionaire real estate mogul, known for his wealth, his charm, and his weakness for married women. I'd met him once, briefly, at a charity gala Linda insisted we attend. He had charisma, I'll give him that. Enough, apparently, to turn my wife into a fool. I took a photo of the planner page, careful to leave it exactly as I'd found it. There was no need to confront her now. Anger is a weapon best wielded with precision, and I wasn't going to waste it on a premature outburst. Returning to my study, I opened my laptop and confirmed my suspicion. Harper was hosting a private Christmas party at one of the city's most luxurious hotels. Penthouse Suite, of course. I leaned back in my chair, considering my options. Linda thought she was being clever, sneaking around. What she didn't realize was that I was already 3 steps ahead. By the time she walked into that penthouse, she'd be stepping into a trap of her own making. The second Linda's car disappeared into the snowy darkness, I knew I didn't have time to waste. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a deliberate act of disrespect. And disrespect is something I've never tolerated. Not in business, not in life, and certainly not in my marriage. I grabbed my coat and slipped a recording pen into my pocket, a small device I'd kept from my corporate years. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Men like me don't act without proof. Proof is power. I opened the tracking app on my phone. The GPS dot on Linda's car moved steadily toward the city, heading straight for the Harbor Grand Hotel. My jaw tightened as I remembered the name attached to that destination, Victor Harper. A self-proclaimed mogul who thrived on exploiting others, both financially and emotionally. I stepped into my car and followed the route at a careful distance. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the streets in an eerie silence. The drive felt longer than it was, but I didn't let my mind wander. Focus was everything. When I arrived at the Harbor Grand, Linda's car was already parked in the underground garage. The hotel loomed above me, a towering symbol of excess and indulgence. I'd been here before, years ago, for a business event. Back then, it represented success. Tonight, it felt like a battlefield. I entered the lobby with confidence. No hesitation. The staff didn't stop me, they rarely do when you act like you belong. I walked straight to the elevators, the penthouse button glowing invitingly. A private key card was required, of course, but that didn't concern me. I had my own methods. A quick conversation with a distracted concierge was all it took to get access. People underestimate how much they reveal when they're eager to please. The elevator ride was silent, the kind of silence that forces you to confront what's coming. I wasn't here to make a scene. Not yet. Tonight was about gathering what I needed to dismantle them both. When the doors opened, I stepped into the foyer of the penthouse. It was exactly what I expected, opulence at its peak. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. But all that beauty felt hollow. I moved quickly and quietly, scanning the room for the best place to plant the recorder. The coffee table in the center of the living area was perfect, close enough to pick up every word but discreet enough to avoid detection. I was about to leave when I heard the ding of the elevator. Footsteps. Laughter. My pulse quickened, not with panic, but with focus. I slipped into the shadows of the hallway, my back against the cold wall. Linda stepped into the penthouse arm in arm with Victor Harper. The sight was almost comical. He was everything I expected, tan, smug, and dripping with the arrogance of a man who thought money made him untouchable. Linda looked at him like he was the answer to a question she should never have asked. "I told you this would be worth sneaking away for," Harper said, his voice oozing with charm. Linda laughed, the sound high-pitched and unfamiliar. "You always know how to make an entrance." They moved into the living room, their voices blending with the faint hum of the city below. I didn't need to hear more. The recorder was in place, and I had seen enough to know this wasn't just a fling. It was a calculated betrayal. I slipped back into the elevator, leaving them to their false intimacy. As the doors closed, I allowed myself a moment of clarity. Harper thought he was untouchable. Linda thought she was clever. Neither of them understood what happens when you push a man like me too far. By the time I reached my car, the beginnings of a plan were already forming. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about strategy. About ensuring that when they fell hard and publicly. Tonight, they'd enjoy their little fantasy. Tomorrow, I'd start taking it apart piece by piece. I sat in the dim glow of my kitchen, the laptop humming softly in front of me. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional tick of the clock on the wall. Linda wouldn't be back for hours. That gave me plenty of time to prepare. She thought I'd never notice. She thought I'd just keep going about my days, oblivious to the betrayal happening under my nose. But the truth is, I'd been watching her for weeks. Not reacting, not confronting, just watching, learning, and waiting. That patience was about to pay off. The Harbor Grand wasn't just a hotel, it was a playground for the city's elite, a place where deals were made and secrets were shared. Victor Harper thought it was his sanctuary. Tonight, it would become his vulnerability. I logged into my private accounts, the ones Linda didn't know existed. Over the years, I'd learned the importance of having a backup plan, even in a marriage. With a few clicks, I transferred our joint savings into a protected trust under my name. The credit cards followed. By the time Linda realized, her financial independence would be a memory. The next step required a bit more finesse. I reached out to an old contact, James Carlisle, a private investigator who owed me more than a few favors. James was a master at digging up dirt, and if there was any on Harper, he'd find it. "Jonathan," he said, his voice gruff but familiar, "long time. What can I do for you?" I didn't waste words. "Victor Harper. I need everything you can get, business dealings, personal life, anything he doesn't want the world to know." James chuckled. "That's a tall order, but for you? Consider it done. I'll have a file by morning." With that in motion, I turned my attention back to Harper's empire. A quick search through public records revealed a goldmine. His properties were heavily mortgaged, his company leveraged to the brink. One bad deal, one whisper of scandal, and it would all come crashing down. But tonight wasn't just about Harper. It was about Linda, too. The woman I'd shared my life with for 35 years had chosen to spit on everything we'd built together. She needed to understand the cost of that decision. When Linda finally returned home, it was nearly midnight. She slipped through the door quietly, her heels clicking softly against the floor. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to read a book, the glow of the overhead light casting shadows across my face. "You're up late," she said, her voice casual. Too casual. "Couldn't sleep," I replied without looking up. "How was your dinner?" "It was fine," she said, slipping off her shoes. "Just catching up with the girls." Her lie hung in the air between us, heavy and obvious. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, avoiding my gaze. She didn't realize I could smell the cologne lingering on her dress, the kind of cologne a man like Harper would wear. I didn't press her. Not yet. Confrontation now would be premature, and I wasn't about to play my hand before the game was ready. The next morning, while Linda was out running her errands, or whatever excuse she'd come up with this time, I met with my lawyer. George Reynolds had been my legal confidant for decades, a man who understood the art of quiet destruction. "Jonathan," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "You've got that look. What's the situation?" I handed him a folder with everything I'd gathered so far, the planner entry, the financial transfers, and notes on Harper's recent activities. "I need two things," I said, my voice steady. "First, I want every asset under my name locked down. Linda doesn't touch a cent unless I say so. Second, I need divorce papers drafted. Effective immediately." George leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this? 35 years is a long time." "It was," I said coldly. "Now it's over." By the afternoon, James had delivered. His report on Harper was a masterpiece of quiet devastation, shady offshore accounts, unreported assets, and whispers of workplace harassment that had been buried under piles of cash. It was more than enough to ruin him, but I wasn't interested in a quick blow. I wanted this to be slow, deliberate. I spent the rest of the day preparing the next move. Harper was about to learn that no empire, financial, social, or personal, was untouchable. As for Linda, she would watch it all unfold, knowing she had chosen the wrong man to betray. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing inside me. Snow battered the windows of the house as I sat in my study, the faint hum of my laptop breaking the heavy silence. By now, I had everything I needed to begin dismantling the facade Linda and Harper had built. But this wasn't about acting recklessly, it was about making them feel every ounce of what they had done to me. Harper's weaknesses were laid out in the report James had provided. He wasn't the untouchable mogul he pretended to be. His fortune was teetering on the edge of collapse, held together by shady offshore accounts and tenuous investor confidence. If one domino fell, the rest would come crashing down. That was where I'd strike first. I reached out to one of Harper's largest investors, a man named Richard Pierce. Richard and I had crossed paths years ago in business, and while we'd never been close, we respected each other. More importantly, he respected the truth. "Jonathan," he answered after a few rings, his voice wary. "What's this about?" "Harper," I said bluntly. "I have information you'll want to see." There was a pause before he spoke again. "Go on." "I'm sending you a file. Review it carefully. It's your money on the line, Richard." I'd suggest acting quickly. I didn't wait for his response before hanging up. People like Richard didn't need convincing once the facts were in front of them. By the end of the week, Harper's investors would be questioning everything, and his empire would begin to crumble. But Harper was only half the equation. Linda had to face the consequences of her actions, too. She thought she could live a double life, reaping the benefits of my hard work while chasing the thrill of Harper's world. That illusion was about to shatter. The next evening, Linda returned home earlier than usual. Her demeanor was different, nervous, almost cautious. Maybe she'd started to sense that something was wrong, though she had no idea how deep my plans ran. "Dinner's ready," I said casually as she walked through the door. The kitchen was set with 2 plates of roast chicken and vegetables, a bottle of wine chilling on the counter. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to mine. "This looks nice. Thought we could spend some time together," I said, pulling out a chair for her. "It's been a while, hasn't it?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, it has." As we ate, I watched her closely. She was trying too hard to act normal, filling the silence with small talk about her day. I let her ramble, waiting for the right moment to strike. "You know," I said finally, setting down my fork, "I've been thinking a lot about trust lately." Her hand froze halfway to her glass of wine. "Oh? What about it?" I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. "How fragile it is. How easy it is to break." Linda's eyes darted to the side, avoiding mine. "Why are you bringing this up?" "Just reflecting," I said, my voice calm. "You've been spending a lot of time out lately. Busy with the girls, right?" Her smile faltered. "Yeah, you know how it is. Holiday season and all that." "Of course," I said, standing up and pouring myself another glass of wine. "But it does make me wonder, how much can you really trust someone when they're hiding things?" Linda's face paled. "Jonathan, what are you trying to say?" I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the living room and retrieved the planner she thought I hadn't noticed. I dropped it onto the table between us, the red-circled date glaring back at her. "You left this out the other night," I said coldly. "Care to explain, penthouse?" "VH?" She stared at the planner, her face a mask of shock and fear. It's not what you think." "Then tell me," I said, my voice sharper now. "What is it?" Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The lie she was trying to form died before it could reach her lips. "That's what I thought," I said, stepping closer. "You've been lying to me for months. Sneaking around, using my money to fund your little adventures. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" "Jonathan, please," she said, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake." "No," I cut her off. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk on the way home. This is betrayal. And I don't forgive betrayal." Linda's eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. She'd made her choices. Now she'd live with the consequences. The following morning, I filed the divorce papers George had prepared. Linda was served by noon, her shocked expression captured in the photograph my lawyer sent me. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Harper still had to pay, and I was just getting started. I didn't stop after Linda's excuses fell apart. Her tears meant nothing to me, they were the desperate attempts of someone trying to escape the consequences of their actions. But there was no escape, not for her, not for Harper. I began the next phase of my plan the moment the divorce papers were served. Linda wasn't just losing her husband, she was losing her comfortable life. I'd already secured our joint assets, locked her out of the accounts, and cancelled every card with her name on it. Now, it was time to dismantle Harper. The investor I contacted, Richard Pierce, had done exactly what I'd hoped. By the end of the day, whispers about Harper's shady dealings were circulating among his top backers. A chain reaction had begun, and the cracks in his empire were starting to show. But I wasn't about to leave it to chance. I reached out to another old connection, a journalist named Claire who thrived on uncovering high-profile scandals. She was the kind of woman who didn't just expose corruption, she thrived on the chaos it caused. "Jonathan," she said when I called, her voice sharp with curiosity. "It's been years. What's got you reaching out now?" "I have a story for you," I replied, my tone calm but deliberate. "Victor Harper. I've got proof of offshore accounts, falsified property valuations, and rumors of harassment that have been buried under NDAs. Interested? There was a pause, and then I heard her smile through the phone. Send it over. I'll make sure it gets the attention it deserves. I forwarded her the dossier James had compiled, along with a few strategic notes of my own. Claire didn't need much direction, she knew exactly how to turn this into a media firestorm. That evening, Linda came into the living room, her face pale and drawn. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She no longer had access to our money, and Harper's world wasn't as inviting as she'd imagined. "Jonathan," she began, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" I didn't look up from my book. "About what?" "I made a mistake," she said quickly. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I let myself get caught up in something that didn't mean anything." I closed the book and set it on the table, finally meeting her gaze. "Didn't mean anything? You lied to me for months, spent my money, and paraded around with that man like I was too blind to see it." "That's not nothing, Linda." Her eyes filled with tears again, but I didn't flinch. "Jonathan, please. We've been married for 35 years. You can't just throw it all away." "I'm not throwing it away," I said coldly. "You did that the moment you stepped into that penthouse." Her pleas continued, but I'd heard enough. I stood and walked out of the room, leaving her to sit in the emptiness she'd created. The next day, the first article about Harper hit the headlines. It was brutal, exposing his offshore accounts and questionable business practices. By noon, his office was flooded with calls from investors demanding explanations. But that was just the beginning. I had James follow up with more details, sending anonymous tips to regulatory agencies and reporters. Within 48 hours, Harper's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. His company's stock plummeted, and whispers of investigations spread like wildfire. Linda, meanwhile, had been calling Harper incessantly. She thought he'd save her, offer her the life she thought she deserved. But Harper wasn't answering. He was too busy watching his empire collapse. That evening, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat by the window, watching the snow fall. Linda sat across the room, silent and defeated. The phone rang, breaking the tense quiet. I picked it up, recognizing Harper's number immediately. "Carter," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." "We have nothing to discuss," I replied, swirling the bourbon in my glass. "You don't understand," he snapped. "You've made your point. You've ruined my reputation. But this is going too far." I chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Too far? You think this is too far? You tried to take my wife and humiliate me in the process. You thought you could play your games without consequences. Tell me, Victor, how does it feel to finally lose?" There was a long silence on the other end. When Harper spoke again, his voice was quieter. "You've made your point, Carter. I'll stay away from Linda. Just back off." I ended the call without responding. This wasn't over. Not yet. Harper needed to lose everything, just like he'd tried to take everything from me. The following morning, the chaos began. Harper's name was plastered across every major news outlet. Headlines screamed of financial misconduct, fraud, and the unraveling of his real estate empire. Social media exploded with speculation, employees came forward with damning stories, and investors scrambled to distance themselves. I watched it all unfold from the comfort of my kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The world Harper had built on lies was crumbling beneath him, and I hadn't even used all the weapons in my arsenal. Linda, on the other hand, was falling apart. She spent most of the morning pacing the living room, her phone clutched in her hand. I knew she was trying to reach him. She'd called him at least a dozen times the night before, and every attempt went unanswered. Finally, she turned to me, desperation written all over her face. "Jonathan," she said hesitantly, "can we talk?" I didn't look up from my phone. "What about?" "It's about Victor," she began, wringing her hands. "I think something's happened. He's not answering my calls." I set my phone down slowly and fixed her with a cold stare. "Something's happened? You mean the fact that his company is collapsing under the weight of his lies? Or that his investors are abandoning him in droves? Which part are you concerned about, Linda?" Her face paled. You knew about this?" I stood, walking toward her with measured steps. "Of course I knew. Did you really think I was going to sit back and do nothing while the two of you tried to humiliate me? While you spent my money and played house with that parasite?" Linda stepped back, her back hitting the wall. "Jonathan, I didn't mean for it to get this far. I was confused, Stop," I snapped, my voice like steel. "You weren't confused. You were selfish. You thought you could have your fun and come back to the life I built for you like nothing happened. But life doesn't work that way, Linda. Not anymore." Her tears began to flow, but I felt nothing. She'd made her choices, and now she was watching the consequences unfold in real time. By the afternoon, Harper was in free fall. His company issued a statement denying the allegations, but it did little to stop the bleeding. The stock plummeted further, his offices were swarmed by reporters, and at least 2 lawsuits were filed against him before the day was over. I decided it was time to deliver the final blow. I called James, who had been quietly monitoring Harper's movements since this began. "Where is he?" "His house," James replied. "He's locked himself in. Reporters are camped outside, but he hasn't made a move all day." "Good," I said. "I'm paying him a visit tonight." James hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise?" "He's desperate, Jonathan. Men like him are dangerous when they're cornered." "So am I," I said before hanging up. That evening, I pulled into Harper's gated mansion, my car headlights cutting through the darkness. The reporters had thinned out, but a few still lingered near the entrance. I ignored them, driving straight through the open gates. The house was as extravagant as I remembered, but tonight it looked like a tomb. The lights inside were dim, and the air around the place felt heavy. I knocked on the door, my fists firm against the ornate wood. Harper opened it after a few moments, his face gaunt and pale. The smug confidence he'd exuded the night I saw him with Linda was gone, replaced by fear and exhaustion. "Carter," he said weakly, stepping back as I entered uninvited. "What do you want?" I shut the door behind me, the sound echoing through the empty halls. "We need to talk." He laughed bitterly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Talk? You've already destroyed my life. What more do you want?" I stepped closer, my presence filling the space between us. "I want you to understand what happens when you cross a man like me. You thought you could take what was mine, humiliate me, and walk away unscathed. You were wrong." Harper backed away, his hands trembling. "It wasn't personal, Carter. It was just business." "Business?" I repeated, my voice low. "You call seducing another man's wife business? Spending my money, taking what I built, and trying to make me a fool? Let me tell you something, Victor. This is personal. And I'm not done yet." I left him standing there, shaking in the middle of his crumbling empire. As I drove away, I knew he'd never recover. His name was ruined, his wealth was gone, and his power was a memory. Back home, Linda was sitting on the couch, staring at the floor. She looked up when I walked in, her face streaked with tears. "What did you do?" she whispered. I didn't answer. She didn't deserve one. The morning after my confrontation with Harper, I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop open as the news continued to pour in. The downfall of Victor Harper wasn't just a story anymore, it was a spectacle. Reporters camped outside his offices, employees leaked documents, and the financial world treated him like a contagion. Every headline, every damning report, was another nail in his coffin. Linda was still upstairs, her door shut tight. She hadn't spoken to me since last night, but her silence said everything. She knew the life she thought she was building with Harper was nothing but ashes now. I sipped my coffee, savoring the bitter taste as I planned my next move. Harper's empire was gone, but he hadn't suffered enough. He was still breathing, still clinging to whatever scraps of pride he had left. I wasn't finished with him yet. I decided to visit his office one last time. The drive downtown was quiet, the snow muffling the usual sounds of the city. By the time I arrived, the scene outside Harper's building was chaotic. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who walked past, their cameras flashing like a paparazzi feeding frenzy. I stepped out of my car and adjusted my coat, my presence immediately drawing attention. Some of the reporters turned their cameras toward me, recognizing my face from the leaked information. I didn't shy away. Let them watch. I walked into the building, past the security guards who didn't even bother to stop me. Harper's office was on the top floor, and the elevator ride felt slower than usual. When the doors opened, I was greeted by the sight of a nearly empty office. Desks were abandoned, papers scattered, and the air was thick with the scent of fear. Harper was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "You," he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" I closed the door behind me, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Just thought I'd check in," I said, leaning casually against the wall. "See how you're holding up." He glared at me, his fists clenching. "You've taken everything from me. My company, my reputation, everything. What more do you want?" I stepped forward, my voice low and controlled. "I want you to understand something, Harper. You tried to take what was mine. You thought you could waltz into my life, take my wife, and leave me with nothing. But the difference between us is that I don't just take, I destroy." Harper stood, his anger flaring. "You think this makes you a man? Ruining another person's life?" I smiled coldly. "No, Harper. What makes me a man is knowing that I don't let anyone disrespect me and get away with it. You played your games, and you lost. You have no one to blame but yourself." He lunged at me, his fists swinging wildly. I stepped aside, letting him crash into the desk. He turned to face me, breathing heavily, but before he could make another move, I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him back into his chair. "Don't embarrass yourself," I said, my voice steady. "You're not worth the effort." He slumped back, defeated. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," I said, releasing my grip. "I've already taken everything that matters. The rest is up to you. But if you ever try to rebuild, if you even think about crossing me again, I'll make sure this time you don't recover." I turned and walked out, leaving him alone in the ruins of his office. The reporters were still waiting outside, their cameras flashing as I stepped into the cold air. I didn't speak to them, didn't even glance their way. My actions spoke louder than any words ever could. When I returned home, Linda was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I entered, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "What happened?" she asked quietly. I poured myself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as I leaned against the counter. "Harper's finished," I said simply. "His company, his name, his future, it's all gone." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "What about me?" I raised an eyebrow, my expression cold. "What about you, Linda? You made your choice. You thought Harper could give you something I couldn't. Well, now you know exactly what that was, nothing." Her tears spilled over, but I didn't move to comfort her. She didn't deserve it. "Jonathan, please. I was wrong. I was stupid. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I finished my drink and set the glass down with a sharp clink. You didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. Actions have consequences, Linda. You made your bed. Now you get to lie in it. I left her there, her sobs echoing through the empty house as I walked to my study. The war was over, but the victory felt hollow. I'd won, but at what cost? Sitting at my desk, I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen. The pieces of my life were scattered, but at least now I could begin to rebuild. Alone. The house was silent when I returned from Harper's office. Snow fell heavily outside, muffling the world, but inside, the tension was suffocating. Linda was sitting in the living room, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She looked up when I walked in, and for the first time in years, I saw something resembling fear in her expression. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took off my coat and hung it by the door, not bothering to look at her. "I cleaned up a mess." "My mess?" "The one you helped create." She flinched as though I'd struck her. "Jonathan, I didn't think it would go this far." I turned to face her, my eyes cold. "That's the problem, Linda. You didn't think. You didn't think about me, about us, about what we built. You thought about yourself. And now, you get to live with the consequences." She stood, her hands trembling. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was just..." "Stop." My voice cut through the room like a blade. "Don't you dare try to diminish this. You lied to me. You betrayed me. You threw away 35 years of marriage for a man who couldn't even hold on to his own life, let alone give you the one you wanted." Her lips quivered, but no words came out. I walked past her, pouring myself a drink from the bar in the corner. The sharp scent of bourbon filled the room as I turned back to her, the glass steady in my hand. "What did you think would happen?" I asked, my tone quieter now, almost dangerous. "Did you think he'd take you away, sweep you off your feet, and you'd live happily ever after? That I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't act?" Linda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was lonely, Jonathan. You were always so distant. You didn't see me anymore." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the empty room. "Lonely? That's your excuse? Do you think I wasn't lonely? That I didn't feel the weight of everything I carried to keep this life running? But I didn't run to someone else, Linda. I stayed. Because that's what commitment looks like. Clearly, you never understood that." She sank back onto the couch, her sobs muffled by her hands. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the distant howl of the wind outside. The next day, I began making arrangements to finalize everything. Harper was finished, his empire crumbled, his reputation destroyed. Now it was time to sever the last ties with Linda. I met with my lawyer again, this time to ensure the divorce proceedings were airtight. George listened carefully as I outlined my plans, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "You being thorough," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't about thoroughness," I replied. "It's about sending a message. To her. To him. To anyone who thinks they can cross me." George nodded, making notes as I continued. "And the house?" "She's out," I said firmly. "It's in my name. She can pack her things and leave. I don't care where she goes, as long as it's not here." By the time I returned home, the papers were ready. Linda was sitting at the dining table, staring blankly out the window. She didn't even turn when I placed the folder in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice flat. "Divorce papers," I said simply. "You can sign them now, or you can have your lawyer look them over. It doesn't matter to me. Either way, you're out of this house by the end of the week." Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't do this." "I can," I said, my voice calm. "And I will. You made your choices, Linda. Now you get to live with them." That night, I packed up the remnants of my life with her. Every photo, every memento, every reminder of what we once were went into a box. As I sealed it shut, I felt a strange sense of closure. Linda stayed in her room, her silence as heavy as the snow falling outside. I didn't check on her. I didn't care anymore. By morning, I'd made arrangements for the movers. The house would be mine again, free of her, free of the lies, free of the betrayal. This wasn't the end, but it was a new beginning. By the time the weekend arrived, the snowstorm had settled, but the chaos I had unleashed was still raging. Harper's name was scorched across every headline, his company's assets frozen pending investigations. Investors were jumping ship faster than he could plead for help. And Linda? She was still here, packing her things into suitcases with trembling hands. I gave her a deadline, out by Sunday evening. I didn't care where she went, as long as it was far from me. But I wasn't finished yet. That afternoon, I called James. He'd been keeping tabs on Harper, feeding me updates as his life unraveled. "He's desperate," James said, his tone as grim as the news he delivered. "Lawyers are circling like vultures, and there's talk of criminal charges. The man's drowning." "Good," I said curtly. "Now I need you to deliver the final message." James hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" "He's already broken." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of everything pressing on me like armor. "It's not enough. Men like him only learn when you leave them with nothing." James sighed but didn't argue. "All right. What do you have in mind?" That evening, I dressed sharply, the kind of look that commanded attention. I drove to the hotel where Harper had been hiding, a far cry from the luxury of his penthouse. When I arrived, the lobby was nearly empty, save for a few weary travelers. The clerk at the front desk barely glanced at me as I walked past, heading for the elevator. Harper was on the third floor. James had confirmed he was alone, drinking himself into oblivion. I knocked on his door, the sound loud and deliberate. It took him a moment to answer, his face pale and haggard. "You," he spat, his voice slurred. "Haven't you done enough?" I pushed past him, entering the small, dimly lit room. Bottles littered the table, the curtains drawn tight. Harper staggered after me, his anger barely hiding the fear in his eyes. "I came to give you a choice," I said, my voice cold and steady. He laughed bitterly, collapsing onto the edge of the bed. "A choice? What choice do I have left? You've destroyed everything." I stepped closer, towering over him. "You can either disappear quietly, leave this city, and never come back, or you can stay and let me finish the job. Believe me, Harper, there's still plenty I can take from you." His hands trembled as he reached for a bottle, but I knocked it out of his grasp. "Enough," I said sharply. "You're not drowning your way out of this." Harper looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "Why are you doing this?" I leaned in, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because you thought you could take what was mine. You thought you could humiliate me and walk away untouched. But now, you're the one who's been humiliated. And if you ever come near me or my life again, I'll make sure the world forgets you ever existed." He didn't respond, his silence a sign of defeat. I stood and walked to the door, pausing only to glance back at him one last time. "Make the right choice, Harper," I said before leaving him to his misery. When I returned home, Linda's car was gone. The house felt emptier than it ever had, but there was a strange peace in the silence. I walked through the halls, the echoes of what we once had lingering like ghosts. In the kitchen, I found a note she'd left on the table. It was short, scribbled hastily. "Jonathan, I'm sorry for everything. I know I've lost you, and I know I deserve this. I hope someday you can forgive me. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. Forgiveness wasn't something I was ready to give, not now, and maybe not ever. The next morning, I met with George to finalize everything. The divorce was in motion, the assets secured. Linda would get nothing more from me, and Harper was effectively erased. As I left George's office, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of betrayal was gone, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing I had taken control of my life back. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about rebuilding. Harper and Linda were chapters of my story, but they weren't the whole book. I had the rest of my life to write, and for the first time in years, I was free to do it on my own terms. Sunday evening came like a slow wave, quiet and heavy. By the time Linda left the house, the sun had set, and the snow had begun to fall again. I stood by the window in the living room, watching her car disappear down the street. It was strange, watching her go after all these years. I should have felt something, grief, relief, maybe even anger. But there was nothing, just a hollow calm, like the eye of a storm. The silence in the house felt different now. It wasn't oppressive anymore, it was clean, like a slate wiped blank. I moved through the rooms, turning off lights, shutting doors, closing the chapter on a life I no longer recognized. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Old habits die hard, I suppose. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the fresh snow. My phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was James. "We've got him," he said, his voice steady but tinged with satisfaction. "Where?" "He's trying to board a private flight out of the state. Looks like he's headed south." I leaned back in my chair, a smile creeping onto my face. "Let him run. He'll find out soon enough that there's nowhere to go." James paused, as if weighing his next words. "Jonathan, don't you think it's enough? The man's got nothing left." "That's the point, James," I said quietly. "Men like him don't stop unless you make them. He needs to know what it feels like to be powerless." James didn't argue. He knew better than that. By the afternoon, the news was everywhere. Harper's assets were frozen, his accounts seized. The authorities were investigating him for financial fraud, and rumors of additional charges were spreading. I spent the day fielding calls from Claire, who was thrilled by the public reaction to her latest exposé. "Jonathan," she said during one call, her voice practically buzzing with energy, "people can't get enough of this. Harper's become the poster boy for greed and arrogance." "Good," I replied simply. As the day went on, I noticed something strange. The satisfaction I'd felt from seeing Harper fall wasn't as sharp as I'd expected. It was there, sure, but it wasn't enough. There was no undoing what had been done. No amount of revenge could erase the betrayal. That evening, I found myself in the study, sorting through old papers. Among the stacks of documents and files was a photo album Linda and I had put together years ago. I almost ignored it, but something made me stop. The first page was a picture of us on our wedding day. I barely recognized the young man staring back at me. There was a light in his eyes, a sense of hope that felt foreign now. Flipping through the pages, I saw the life we'd built together, vacations, holidays, small moments that felt enormous at the time. And then, as I turned the last page, it hit me, it was all gone. Not just the marriage. The trust. The belief that what we had was unshakable. The next morning, I called George. "It's done," I told him. "Make sure the divorce is finalized quickly." He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. With Linda gone and Harper ruined, the house felt like a stranger's place. I spent the day packing away the last remnants of the life I'd left behind. Boxes of photos, keepsakes, and letters went into the attic, out of sight but not forgotten. By evening, I stood on the balcony, a glass of bourbon in hand. The city stretched out before me, quiet and cold under the blanket of snow. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace.